I would like to cover today what we've learned at the MPA in the last year. I was one of the two people who was associated with the U.S. contingent here in Montenegro at the time. I was working as a consultant at the Ministry of Defense in August of 2022 when the attack occurred. My colleague and I just volunteered. We just showed up at the front door and started helping. I was deeply involved in the activities that were occurring at the U.S. Embassy, and so I got a view into both what happened in Montenegro in terms of the MPA and in terms of the international assistance that was brought in to assist. I'd like to put things into historical perspective since the MPA has come a long way. I'm going to do a quick recap of what happened in August of 2022 and what lessons were learned from that incident. The Ministry of Public Administration got hit with a ransomware attack. They called themselves the Cuba Group. That's a false flag. There's no evidence there was ever any association with the nation of Cuba. It's quite common with these hacking groups. They try to fake people out in any way they can, and this is just part of the attack methodology. It was a very sophisticated attack. They exploited a zero-day flaw in Microsoft software. And by definition, I'm using some technical terms here, and I'm not sure that everyone's technical, so please forgive me if you are. I'm going to just do quick explanations of what that means. The zero-day attack is an attack using code or methods that have never been seen before. The closest metaphor is COVID-19. Nobody had an immunity to it. That's a zero-day attack on the human population. In the case of computer viruses, the adversaries will design it in such a way that it can't be identified by any antivirus, at least the antivirus products that are based on signatures. Antivirus products generally are looking for patterns that describe previously observed viruses. This was not a previously observed virus. The group also had three other names: Cold Draw, Tropical Scorpus, and Fidel. Again, probably a reference to Fidel Castro. The lack of network segmentation allowed the damage to cascade throughout the network until it encountered an internal barrier. Many of the ministries were directly connected to the Ministry of Public Administration. So when the MPA got hit, it just went all the way through to the other ministries, except for a few that had access controls facing the Ministry of Public Administration. So there was a barrier there. The Ministry of Defense, for example, wasn't impacted, even though they had a connection to the Ministry of Public Administration. The Cuba Group, I should explain what I mean by cascade. A metaphor, the sinking of the Titanic. Probably everyone here has seen the movie. When the Titanic hit an iceberg, it left a large gaping hole in the bow. The Titanic had bulkheads, vertical walls that ran all the way from the bottom, but they didn't go all the way to the top. The ship was divided into compartments, but since those barriers, those bulkheads, didn't go all the way to the top, the water just went from one to the next, until it sank the ship. That's essentially what happened in this attack. And instead of taking over an hour for the Titanic to sink, this happened at light speed. If humans had actually been watching it, they may not have been able to respond, not quickly enough. There's a problem inherent in cybersecurity, and that is the attack surface favors the attacker, not the defender. The defender has to be correct 100% of the time. The attacker only has to be correct 1% of the time. And the attacker can take their time and do their reconnaissance, do their examination of the network, and the defender only may have milliseconds in order to respond. So it cascaded throughout the network. It caused significant damage. MPA wasn't alone. It may have seemed that way because the attack was so extreme in terms of its damage, but there were 101 entities that were impacted by the Cuba ransomware. 65 were in the United States, 36 outside the United States. They demanded a total of $145 million in ransom, of which they collected $60 million. Now, these sources are from the US CISA. The victims were retailers, financial and logistical services, government agencies, manufacturers in the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So this was, at a high level, a rather mundane attack since so many people were hit. But it caused a lot of damage at the MPA. The contributing factors were, it began on the weekend. There was nobody there. Now, this is common. The attackers will try to attack, well, we have a saying in English, when the cat's away, the mice will play. They try to attack when they know that there's the least likelihood of someone observing what they're doing. So they'll attack on a weekend, preferably one that has a Monday off at the end of the weekend, so they have 3 days. And at the time, the MPA just simply didn't have the resources to have somebody watching the systems 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Although, even if they did, they may not have been able to stop it. They had inadequate staffing levels. They had 7 people managing thousands of systems. They just didn't have enough staff. They didn't have the human resources to keep up with what was happening. Now, there were indications that someone was attempting to attack the network previous to when the attack was actually executed. But the software they were using was on demonstration, and the demonstration license expired. So there was a gap of time between when the reconnaissance was occurring and when the attack occurred, where they didn't have the tools to be able to even observe what was going on. They had inadequate network segmentation. Essentially, they had none, except for what the other ministries had installed facing the MPA. It was a flat network. A flat network is where every node is able to communicate with every other node. It's pretty much the opposite of what we call the zero trust model, where none of the systems trust each other. Here it was like an auditorium. Anybody who stood up and shouted could be heard by anybody at the other end of the auditorium. So it just spread like wildfire once it was executed. And they had inadequate backups. Backups are your last line of defense. If all else fails, if your entire network gets destroyed by ransomware, you can still restore from backup. Of course, you have to remove the ransomware that's also in the backup. So you have to know what it was. And you might have to move back days or weeks and restore from a previous backup that didn't include the ransomware software in it. But then you can reconstruct the newer information piece by piece. What they had to do instead was just reconstruct everything piece by piece. It was a huge jigsaw puzzle, putting everything back together again. In the response, there was an initial assessment. That was conducted by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, other countries, and their staff. I was at the embassy when this was happening, and I saw that it was all hands on deck. Everybody tried to assist. And all of the senior members of the embassy were involved in just trying to help Montenegro. They called in the FBI, they called in the Maine National Guard, which is a partner organization with the Ministry of Defense. And so they had at least relationships with Montenegro. And they brought in some other agencies I shouldn't talk about, but it was examined very carefully. The United Kingdom also brought in analysts. France brought in people who did an assessment and wrote an excellent report about what had happened. There was a lot of international assistance. they needed the assistance because they simply didn't have the resources to be able to do what was accomplished by external entities and assisting nations. The malware was eradicated, but it wasn't easy. It was a lot of work. It took weeks to be able to find it all and try to clean it up. It's not good enough to just restore the information, overwrite the encrypted data with new data because the malware was still there. And so there was a lot of work that occurred there. And there were also issues about whether or not the hardware itself may have been damaged by the malware, because there were certain parts of the hardware that can be harmed. The UEFI, the old people here will call it the BIOS, could be overwritten, in which case the hardware itself was corrupt. There's a complete rebuild of thousands of servers, services, workstations, data repositories. It was basically a complete reconstruction. It was as if it had just been burned to the ground and it had to be rebuilt brick by brick. It took a long time. There were a lot of people who were unhappy about it. People didn't understand why it was taking so long because they didn't understand the scope of the amount of work that had to be conducted. And since they've begun deploying new technologies, new techniques, and they've hired on some wonderful people who are very good at their job. I wish there were more of them. I'll talk a bit about that. But they brought on some very talented, young, energetic, curious, motivated people, which is exactly what we need to work as analysts and to assist with keeping this from happening again, standing up to new technologies. The other recovery efforts were the Directorate for Information Security created a computer incident response team that's intended to work 24/7. There's participation now in international forums. That's already been described in earlier presentations. They replaced their firewall with a new technology firewall that is better than what they had before. They rewrote the firewall configuration from scratch, which meant they had to do a full re-audit of what exposures they needed out to the internet, which was very good. They installed centralized management tools, including a security event incident management system. This is basically a system that gives you a dashboard into everything that's happening related to information security within the system. They installed an advanced endpoint antivirus system, which is better than what they had. I am a bit cynical about antivirus in general, so I'm never going to say any of them are perfect, because they're all, to some extent, based on signatures, and they're all somewhat vulnerable to zero-day attacks, because they depend on definitions that were written in the past. They installed email protection. They had installed and implemented an email gateway, sandboxing, antivirus, network forensic tools, diversity of detection and analysis tools. They implemented two-factor authentication for remote email and VPN access, and that's very important. All remote access should require two-factor authentication. Using passwords alone for remote access is just a recipe for disaster. It's just too easy for phishing attacks to acquire someone's password, and then once that's leaked, the adversaries who are able to gain access to the network can do any number of things that are evil. They also identified 87 computers since the attack. They've identified 87 computers that were compromised in some way or behaving in a malicious way, and removed them from the network, notified the competent authorities. They issued 56 warnings with regard to identified threats. They made significant improvements and enhancements in both data backup capacity and process. Again, that's your last resort. to ransomware. Now, they rebuilt altogether after the attack 2,300 workstations. Now, you can imagine what that would be like with 7 people. It was an enormous amount of work that they did, and it's nothing short of heroic what they accomplished in the amount of time that they did it. They centralized servers for 24 state institutions because they had this dispersion of servers all over the place. They centralized them so they could manage them and they could observe what was happening on those servers, including 87 systems within the MPA were also centralized. They created a web portal so the public could access timely information in the local language about attacks, about attack methodologies, about cyber hygiene, and view more detailed information about what was happening. Education is really the best investment you can possibly make. If you have a limited budget, spend it on education, because people are your greatest risk. They've conducted 16 trainings in the field doing cyber crisis resolution, really good cyber range trainings where they dealt with very well simulated attacks, sometimes with simulated red teams. And not just in Montenegro, but also in Albania, possibly others I don't recall, but at least I know about Albania.
It was Macedonia too.
And Macedonia, North Macedonia. 260 employees have received cyber hygiene training, and including 20 state and private institutions as well. And multiple other trainings and exercises have been conducted for security staff. So they've really stood up in terms of getting people the knowledge that they need in order to deal with these challenges. That's probably the best place you could possibly spend your money and your attention, but they've done all of the other things as well. So they've done an excellent job. Going forward, a point I would like to try to make, and I think it's important that it be made frequently, is that they're never going to reach perfect security. It's not going to happen. It's not possible. It's already been said in this convention today by several people. But resiliency is achievable. If a system is compromised, you can develop enough resiliency capability that you can restore it. And it might be something as simple as just restoring for backup. To use a metaphor, it's impossible to inoculate the entire human population from every possible communicable disease. But if people get sick and their immune system identifies the virus, launches a response, gets rid of the virus, and then remembers what that was so that it doesn't get sick again and develops immunity, that's resilience. You can do the same thing with information systems. You can learn from the mistakes or learn from the weaknesses and move on. One of the biggest challenges in terms of ever achieving perfect security is that most of the software is pretty bad. These companies will release software when it's only half-baked. They'll just foist it on the population and expect the population to find the bugs, report the bugs, and then they'll release patches for the bugs. So the software itself, the foundation of the building, is weak and has holes in it. A gram of prevention is worth a kilogram of detection and a ton of correction. I've changed that from imperial units. We would say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you're going to expend efforts, try to expend it on prevention and a little less on detection. If you're able to prevent an attack from occurring, you don't need detection. And the problem with detection is it's reactive. The problem has already happened. As we say, the horse is already out of the barn. You've already experienced a loss. It's putting in detection is like having a shop with goods in the shop And instead of locking the doors, you put in more alarms. Well, you're only going to hear an alarm when somebody's already in the building. So there is a difference, almost a conflict in doctrines between prevention and detection. Prevention is labor intensive. If you try to establish, for example, a zero trust model where none of the systems inside a network trust each other, where everything has to be access controlled, you're constantly going to have to revise it. You're constantly going to have to monitor for failures of traffic in that zero trust model. I personally implemented that years ago at Yahoo, and the developers hated me because every time they developed a new product and they needed to send traffic across the network, it would fail until they got a hold of me, and then I would allow it, approve it inside the network. During that time, they never had a single production system compromised. But it's a great deal of work. It's a great deal of effort. So, given the fact that we have limited human resources, doing detection instead is kind of an adaptation to not having enough resource. It's the only other choice you have available to you. If the resources are eventually built up, then spending more time on prevention would be a good idea. But right now, the prevention is pretty much minimal on the interior network because that's the best we can do with the people we have. Correction, of course, is the last resort. You don't want to be correcting the failure if you can avoid it. You want to detect it and stop it, or better yet, prevent it. What's needed is people. When I'm asked what's the greatest risk to an information system, my answer is people. Because one clueless, careless person can destroy all of the countermeasures that you're able to stand up. But by the same token, your greatest resource is people. We are, when we're defending a network, defending against other human beings with all of their cleverness, with all of their cunning, with their knowledge of the systems we're using to protect that network. And to counter human ingenuity, you need humans. Only so much can be done with the detection technologies because your adversaries know what you're using and know how to get around it. That's their job. So what we really need is people. And the problem, and it's been discussed earlier, how do you keep those people? Recruitment and retention requires incentives. Now, engineers are mostly incentivized by growth and challenge and by association with colleagues that they respect. Those are the intrinsic rewards. The extrinsic rewards are recognition, which usually costs nothing, and advancement, preferably within your own organization, not just someplace else, and compensation. Those challenges need to be addressed, and they have been, and I feel the MPA has done a good job of addressing them, but it's going to continue to be a challenge. That's not going to go away. And more effort toward the security essentials. There are about 9 axioms in cybersecurity. If you follow 9 rules, you'll resolve 90% of the problems. And one of them is you can't secure what you don't know you have. You need to have a complete inventory of all of the systems that are on the network, what software is running on each one of them, who uses each of them, who administers each of them, what are the valid uses of the system. If you don't have that, you can't even detect what's abnormal because you don't know what normal is. You're dependent on automated detection tools, which may miss things and more frequently send you false alarms over and over about activities that are actually valid. but you don't even know that. So an inventory is absolutely essential. And it's long, hard, arduous, thankless work. And it takes a lot of time. And if you have limited staff, how do you do that? It's a challenge. And identification and removal of unmanaged and orphan systems. And again, you need an inventory to know what's managed and what isn't managed. The orphan systems are often referred to as loose cannons because they're a danger. Just even one is a danger to have it on the network. If you don't know what it does and you're not managing it and it's just sitting there on your network, it can be doing anything. And it often will do anything. Basic access controls formulated from use case analytics. I'll describe use case analytics. It's really it's a part of the zero trust model. You identify what's normal on your network. This system talks to this system. So you permit this system to talk to this system, but nothing else. If you allow everything to send traffic to everything else, then you're going to have a problem because when something bad comes along, it's not going to be stopped. Use case analysis requires a lot of work. There are automated tools that will assist, but it still requires manual effort. And network topology documentation. If you don't have that, it's like driving in a strange city without a map. You need to know what's connected to what, and what the dependencies are, and where the failure points are. So that's something that we could improve. We could do more of. And people with fundamental specialties. 24/7 monitoring. That takes a lot of people to do that. Access control creation and revision, use case analysis, I've already discussed. Alert tuning and false positive elimination. When you get these automated detection tools, at first they're alarming about everything. They send you alarms because the sun's come up. They send you alarms because it's a full moon. They need to be tuned, and that takes time and a lot of effort. It takes human beings to tune those systems. This keeps coming back. It's a common theme. People. Software patching, that needs to be done aggressively. And you need to know where, if there's a particular piece of software that needs to be patched and it doesn't update itself automatically like Windows does, then you need to know where it is or whether or not you even have it. And now we're back to the inventory again. So the only way to aggressively patch the software is to know every single place where a particular piece of software happens to reside. If, say for example, Adobe Reader has a vulnerability, you need to know every system that has Adobe Reader on it and what version it is, and then take care of the problem. There are tools that will do that for you, but all the systems have to be managed. If they're unmanaged systems on the network, you don't know. You don't know what's running on those systems. Threat hunting and penetration testing, that's mostly manual. That requires specialists who have good knowledge of the techniques. Threat intelligence, the MPA is doing this. They belong to NISP. They have other sources of threat intelligence. And it takes time for people to go through and analyze that information. Forensic investigations and analysis, that's another specialty, and it's something that only somebody with a particular type of temperament would even want to do. It's highly detailed and, to me personally, extremely boring. But there are people who are really good at forensics.
Thanks, Patrick.
Sorry. Network infrastructure documentation. The network's changing all the time. You need to have somebody who's updating that information and audit and assessments. Every now and then you need to go through and you need to take a record of everything that's there and what it does and what level of capability it has in terms of being managed. And all of this takes people. Any questions? Oh, please, somebody have a question. Out of time out for questions.
You obviously said it all.
I guess, or I bored everybody to sleep, and I apologize.
No, awesome presentation.
You were thorough. That's the issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.